You don't belong here! Get out now! Stop it!
Gate agent kicks black girl in wheelchair, and until sister's bold move freezes entire airline in a way that proves sometimes the children racists abuse have the courage to turn terminals into stages for civil rights confrontations that force hundreds of witnesses to choose between complicity and intervention, between silence and justice, between watching cruelty or stopping it. You little thieves probably stole these tickets from someone's purse. There's no way black kids like you can afford first-class seats. I'm confiscating these until we verify they're not fraudulent. Now sit down and be quiet before I call security on both of you. A white gate agent's voice cut through Gate 22 at Chicago O'Hare International Airport with such venom it seemed to poison the air itself. Her face twisted with contempt as she stood over two black girls, 13-year-old Amara Johnson, and her 11-year-old sister Nia, who sat in a wheelchair, both of them trying to board Delta Airlines Flight 2156 to Atlanta for their grandmother's 85th birthday celebration, both of them holding legitimate tickets their parents had purchased weeks ago. Both of them now being accused of theft by a woman whose name tag read Rebecca Morrison and whose racism was so confident it didn't bother hiding behind professional language. The accusation hit Amara like a physical assault, the words "you little thieves" landing with the weight of every stereotype, every assumption, every bit of prejudice that looked at black children and saw criminals instead of kids, saw threats instead of travelers, saw suspicion instead of innocence, and she felt her hands start shaking as she tried to process what was happening, tried to understand how presenting boarding passes at a gate had somehow transformed into being called thieves, how doing everything right had resulted in being treated like they'd done everything wrong. "Ma'am, these are our tickets," Amara said, her voice trembling but trying to maintain the politeness her parents had taught her was protection. "Our parents bought them for us. We have confirmation emails. We can show you everything. We're traveling as unaccompanied minors. We have all the documentation. Please just scan our tickets and you'll see they're legitimate. We need to get to Atlanta for our grandmother's birthday. It's really important." This wasn't history, wasn't something her parents had experienced in the 1960s that she only knew from books and documentaries. This was happening right now in 2025 at a major American airport where diversity initiatives and anti-discrimination training were supposed to have eliminated the kind of profiling that looked at black children and decided they must be thieves, must be frauds, must be doing something illegal because the assumption of black criminality was so deeply embedded that even a child in a wheelchair wasn't exempt from suspicion, wasn't granted the basic dignity of being believed when she said the tickets were hers. And if you think racism died somewhere between the civil rights movement and today, if you believe we've evolved past gate agents treating black passengers as criminals based solely on their appearance, then you need to understand that hatred didn't disappear, it just learned to wear name tags and hide behind claims about security protocols and fraud prevention, while inflicting the same dehumanizing assumptions it always has, maybe worse now because it happens while everyone pretends we treat all travelers equally, while official procedures mask prejudice that's as vicious as anything from segregation. Amara had experienced microaggressions before, had dealt with teachers who assumed she was less capable despite being an honor student, store employees who followed her through aisles, adults who seemed surprised when she spoke articulately, but being called a thief in an airport while trying to travel with her disabled sister felt different, felt like racism that had stopped pretending to be anything else, that had decided these black girls were safe targets for accusations that could derail their entire trip, that could make them miss their grandmother's birthday, that could transform excitement into trauma. She'd been shocked when Rebecca first questioned where they'd gotten the tickets, had thought maybe it was standard procedure for unaccompanied minors, but as Rebecca continued insisting the tickets were stolen despite Amara offering to show proof of purchase, she realized with sinking certainty that this wasn't about verification. This was about racism. This was exactly what her parents had warned her might happen. And the recognition mixed with weary familiarity because of course this was happening, of course their blackness was being criminalized, of course being excellent children with proper documentation wasn't protection against someone who decided they were guilty before examining any evidence. Nia looked up at her older sister with tears starting to form, her 11-year-old face showing confusion and fear because she didn't fully understand why this woman was being so mean, why having tickets wasn't enough, why they were being treated like they'd done something wrong when they'd followed every rule, and she whispered to Amara, "Why is she calling us thieves? We didn't steal anything, Mom and Dad bought these tickets. Can we call them and have them explain?" And Amara pulled out her phone saying, "Yes, let's call Dad right now, he can talk to her and clear this up." But before she could dial, Rebecca snatched the phone from her hand with such aggression that several nearby passengers gasped. And Rebecca said, "You don't get to make calls, you don't get to contact anyone until we verify your story. These phones are being held as evidence," and she grabbed Nia's phone from the wheelchair armrest too. And both girls watched their only connection to their parents disappear into Rebecca's pocket. "Please give us our phones back," Amara said, tears flowing freely. "Now, we need to call our parents. You can't just take our property, we're minors, we have rights." And Rebecca laughed, actually laughed at their distress, and said, "You have the right to sit quietly and wait while I investigate whether you committed fraud. Now stop making a scene or I'll have security remove you from the terminal entirely. You people always cause problems, always think rules don't apply to you." And her casual cruelty, her comfort with tormenting children, her confidence that she could do this without consequences, made clear this wasn't the first time she'd abused her authority, wasn't the first time she'd targeted vulnerable passengers who she assumed had no power to fight back. Other travelers at Gate 22 were watching this confrontation with varying levels of discomfort, some pulling out phones to record, some shifting in their seats and looking away, some actually smiling like the girls' distress was entertaining, like watching black children being accused of theft was amusing rather than horrifying, and not one person spoke up, not one adult said this is wrong, leave these children alone. Not one passenger used their voice or their privilege to challenge Rebecca's obvious racism, and their silence felt like participation, felt like permission for Rebecca to continue, felt like abandonment that added to the girls' trauma because they were learning in real time that witnesses to injustice wouldn't necessarily try to stop it. If you believe children in wheelchairs should never be targeted by racist gate agents who decide black passengers are thieves, keep watching, because what happens when the older sister decides to fight back will show you the power of refusing to accept injustice quietly. And if you've ever been treated like a criminal because of how you look, drop a comment below and tell us your story. Tell us where you're watching from and what time it is, because this story doesn't end the way you think, so hit that like button if you stand against racism and subscribe to this channel because we're exposing incidents that airlines don't want you to see. Amara tried one more time to reason with Rebecca, saying, "Please ma'am, just scan our tickets, just verify them in your system, you'll see they're legitimate. You'll see our parents purchased them. We're not thieves, we're just kids trying to get to our grandmother's birthday." But Rebecca's face showed she'd made up her mind, showed she was enjoying the power she had over these black girls, showed she had no intention of treating them fairly, and she said, "I've told you to be quiet, now if you say one more word I'm calling security." And Amara realized that asking nicely wasn't working, that politeness wasn't protection, that she was going to have to fight back. But to understand how two sisters who'd been so excited about this trip ended up being accused of theft at an airport gate, how a 13-year-old ended up having to defend herself and her disabled sister against a racist gate agent, we need to go back 8 hours to a loving home on Chicago's South Side where this morning started not with confrontation but with careful preparation and a grandmother's upcoming celebration that meant everything to this family. Amara Grace Johnson, 13 years old, was an 8th grader at Kenwood Academy where she maintained a 3.9 GPA and served as student council vice president, a responsible kid who her parents trusted with adult-level tasks, who'd been helping care for her younger sister Nia since the car accident 6 months ago that had left Nia with spinal injuries requiring a wheelchair for mobility while she went through physical therapy and recovery. Nia Marie Johnson, 11 years old and in 6th grade at the same school, was a bright, creative child who loved art and music, who'd been devastated when doctors said she'd need months of rehabilitation before she could walk again, who'd been working incredibly hard in physical therapy and making progress that her doctors said was remarkable for someone her age. Their parents, David and Michelle Johnson, had raised them with constant awareness that being black meant facing challenges their white peers wouldn't face, that excellence was expected but wouldn't necessarily protect them, that they needed to be twice as good to get half as far, lessons that felt heavy for children to carry but that their parents knew were necessary for survival. The sisters had a bond strengthened by Nia's injury, Amara stepping naturally into a caretaker role that went beyond typical sibling dynamics, helping Nia with tasks that used to be simple, advocating for her at school when accessibility wasn't considered, being her fierce protector against anyone who treated her disability as weakness rather than temporary circumstance. They had inside jokes about Nia's wheelchair being a secret race car, had developed a shorthand language of looks that let them communicate without words, had learned to navigate a world that wasn't designed for wheelchairs with teamwork and humor that kept Nia's spirits up even when recovery felt slow. Amara had learned from watching Nia's resilience, had seen her little sister face physical therapy that was painful and exhausting without complaining, had witnessed dignity in the face of loss that taught her more about strength than any book could, and this trip to Atlanta was supposed to be a celebration of that strength, a reward for Nia's hard work, a chance to show their grandmother that Nia was healing. That morning they'd woken early, both girls too excited to sleep, and they'd packed their suitcases with clothes and gifts for their grandmother Gloria, who was turning 85, who'd raised 6 children including their father, who'd marched in Selma and lived through segregation and was a living connection to civil rights history that made this birthday milestone feel sacred. Their parents had driven them to O'Hare, their father David giving them final instructions about staying together, being polite to airline staff, calling immediately if anything felt wrong, trusting Amara to advocate for both of them if issues arose, and their mother Michelle had reviewed Nia's medications and accessibility needs, had made sure the airline knew a wheelchair user was traveling, had prepared documentation for the unaccompanied minor protocols that both girls would follow. Check-in at the Delta counter had been smooth, the agent processing their tickets and commenting on how responsible they seemed, and TSA security had been accommodating with Nia's wheelchair, agents helping her through the accessible screening without making her feel like a burden, everything proceeding exactly as it should when systems work properly and people treat travelers with dignity regardless of age or disability. They'd waited at gate 22 for an hour, Amara doing homework while Nia drew in her sketchbook, both of them texting their parents and their grandmother about their excitement, normal pre-flight behavior that gave no warning that boarding would transform into nightmare. When their flight started boarding, Amara had gathered their bags and pushed Nia's wheelchair toward the gate, and that's when they'd first encountered Rebecca Morrison, a white woman probably in her late 40s who was working the gate podium, and Rebecca had looked at them with an expression that shifted from neutral to hostile so quickly it was startling, had looked at their first-class tickets, at their black faces, at Nia's wheelchair, and had decided something was wrong, had decided. These children didn't belong, had decided that verification was necessary in ways it hadn't been for the white passengers who'd boarded ahead of them, and she'd held up her hand in a stop gesture and said, "I need to examine these tickets more closely, there's something that doesn't look right, hand them over and step aside while I verify them." Amara had handed over their boarding passes with growing unease, watching Rebecca study them with exaggerated scrutiny, turning them over, holding them up to the light, frowning like she was discovering evidence of forgery, and after 2 full minutes of this theatrical inspection Rebecca said, "Where did you get these tickets? Who purchased them for you? Because I'm seeing some irregularities that require explanation before I can allow you to board." "Our parents bought them," Amara explained, trying to keep her voice steady. "Our mom and dad purchased them online 3 weeks ago. We can show you the confirmation email. We have all the documentation. We're unaccompanied minors traveling to Atlanta for our grandmother's birthday. Everything is legitimate. Please just scan them and you'll see they're valid in your system." Rebecca's frown deepened as if the girl's reasonable explanation was somehow suspicious rather than reassuring, and she said, "I'm not just going to scan tickets that look questionable. I need to understand how 2 children," she paused and her tone made clear what she really meant was how 2 black children can afford first-class tickets to Atlanta. "Where did your parents get the money for this? Did they use their own credit card? Can you prove ownership of the payment method?" The questions were invasive and inappropriate, were implying theft or fraud based on nothing except the girl's appearance, and Amara felt anger cutting through her fear as she said, "Our father is an accountant and our mother is a nurse. They work hard and they saved money to send us to our grandmother's birthday. We don't have to prove anything except that our tickets are valid. Now please scan them so we can board before our flight leaves." But Rebecca seemed offended by Amara's assertiveness, seemed to interpret a 13-year-old defending herself as disrespect that required punishment, and she said, "Don't take that tone with me, young lady. I'm a gate agent with 20 years of experience and I know suspicious tickets when I see them. These look fake, these look like they were stolen or purchased with stolen credit cards, and I'm not letting you board until I've thoroughly investigated. Now sit down over there and wait while I make some calls." The accusation of theft landed like a slap, was so shocking in its directness that Amara couldn't immediately respond, couldn't process that an adult was actually calling them thieves in public based on nothing, and Nia started crying, her 11-year-old understanding enough to know they were being accused of something terrible, enough to feel the humiliation of being targeted but not enough to understand why an adult would be so cruel. "We're not thieves," Amara said, her voice shaking with tears now. "We didn't steal anything. Our tickets are real. Our parents are good people who worked hard to give us this trip. Why are you being so mean to us? What did we do wrong?" And Rebecca said, "What you're doing wrong is trying to board my flight with suspicious tickets, trying to scam the airline, trying to take advantage of the system, and I'm not going to let that happen on my watch. Now I told you to sit down and wait. Do I need to call security to make you comply?" Other passengers in the boarding line were watching this confrontation with varying expressions, some uncomfortable, some curious, some actually nodding like they agreed with Rebecca's suspicions. Like two black children with first-class tickets naturally warranted investigation, and not one person spoke up to say this seems wrong. Not one adult challenged Rebecca's obvious profiling. Not one passenger used their voice to defend children who were clearly being mistreated. "Please just look at our phones," Amara begged, pulling out her iPhone to show Rebecca the confirmation email. "We have proof right here. You can see the purchase date and the credit card used and everything. Please just look at it." And she held out her phone with the email displayed, with all the documentation that proved beyond any doubt that their tickets were legitimately purchased, that their parents had paid for them, that there was no theft or fraud or scam. Rebecca glanced at the phone screen and said, "I don't trust anything you're showing me. You could have faked those emails. You could have stolen someone's phone. I need official verification from the airline system." And she turned away to her computer, began typing with deliberate slowness, began what appeared to be a performance of investigation rather than actual verification, began wasting time in ways that would make the girls miss their flight if she delayed them long enough. Amara looked at Nia, who was crying harder now, whose tears were streaming down her face as she sat in her wheelchair being treated like a criminal, being subjected to humiliation in front of dozens of strangers, being taught the lesson that their parents had tried to prepare them for but that no preparation could fully cushion, which was that being black meant being presumed guilty, meant having your legitimacy questioned, meant facing cruelty from adults who should protect you but instead targeted you. "I want to call Daddy," Nia said through her tears. "I want him to come get us. I don't want to fly anymore. This lady is being mean and I want to go home." And Amara said, "Okay, baby, let's call Dad right now. He'll talk to her and fix this." And she pulled out her phone again to dial their father David, hoping an adult voice would penetrate Rebecca's racism, hoping their father's professional demeanor would convince her to just scan the tickets and let them board. But before Amara could complete the call, before she could even dial the full number, Rebecca looked up from her computer and saw Amara with her phone and said, "What did I tell you about showing me things from your phone? I said I don't trust anything you have. Now put that away." And Amara said, "I'm calling my father so he can speak with you, so he can verify that he purchased these tickets." And Rebecca's face transformed from hostile to furious, and she said, "You're not calling anyone those phones could be evidence. You're not making calls that might alert accomplices." And she reached across the podium and snatched Amara's iPhone from her hands with such aggression that Amara gasped. And Rebecca said, "These phones are being confiscated until we complete our investigation. They're potential evidence in a fraud case." And before either girl could protest, she walked around the podium and grabbed Nia's phone from where it rested on her wheelchair armrest, taking both devices and putting them in her jacket pocket like she had every right to steal children's property. "Give us our phones back," Amara said, her voice rising with panic because their phones were their lifeline, were their only way to contact their parents, were their safety net that was supposed to protect them in situations exactly like this. "You can't just take our phones. That's our property. We need them to call our parents. Please give them back right now." But Rebecca just shook her head and said, "I've already explained that these are evidence. You'll get them back after we've verified your story. If your story checks out, then there's no problem. But until then, the phones stay with me. Now sit down and be quiet while I continue my investigation, or I will call security and have you removed from this terminal. Do you understand me?" The threat of security was designed to frighten them into compliance, was meant to make them stop advocating for themselves, was the particular weapon that authority figures use against people they've decided don't deserve fair treatment, and Amara felt terror mixing with rage because they were trapped, were powerless, were at the mercy of someone who'd already decided they were guilty. Nia was sobbing openly now, her small body shaking in her wheelchair, and she said to Amara, "I want mommy. I want to go home. Why won't she give us our phones? Why is she being so mean? We didn't do anything bad." And Amara knelt beside her sister's wheelchair and tried to comfort her even though she herself was crying, tried to be strong even though she felt like falling apart, tried to protect Nia from the full weight of what was happening even though protection was impossible when racism was. This explicit, this cruel, this unconcerned with the damage it was inflicting on children. "I know, baby," Amara whispered, wiping Nia's tears with shaking hands. "I know you're scared. I'm scared too, but we're going to be okay. Someone will help us. Someone has to help us." And even as she spoke the reassuring words, she looked around the gate area at the dozens of passengers who were watching this unfold, who were witnessing a gate agent confiscate children's phones and accuse them of theft. And she saw discomfort on some faces but no intervention, saw people looking away rather than meeting her eyes, saw the collective decision to not get involved that was enabling Rebecca's abuse. A white woman in her 60s sitting near the gate actually laughed, a sound so shocking in its cruelty that Amara's head snapped toward her, and the woman said to her companion loud enough for everyone to hear, "Those kids probably did steal those tickets. You know how they are, always trying to get something for nothing." And her companion nodded and said, "It's good that gate agent is being thorough. We can't have thieves on our flights." And both women looked at Amara and Nia with expressions mixing contempt and satisfaction, looked at two crying children and saw criminals deserving punishment rather than victims needing protection. The casual racism, the comfortable cruelty, the way these white passengers felt free to mock black children's suffering, added a layer of trauma that was almost worse than Rebecca's direct assault because it proved the gate agent wasn't an aberration, wasn't one bad actor, was part of a system where multiple people could watch children being tortured and feel nothing except perhaps amusement. A black couple sitting across the gate area looked like they wanted to intervene, the woman whispering urgently to her husband, but he shook his head and said quietly, "We can't. If we get involved they'll target us too. They'll delay our flight. It's not worth it." And the woman looked at Amara and Nia with an expression mixing guilt and fear. Looked like she understood she was choosing self-preservation over protecting vulnerable children. Looked like she hated herself for it but was making that choice anyway because challenging racism felt too costly, too dangerous, too likely to result in her own victimization. Amara heard this exchange and felt abandonment so profound it was physical, felt the weight of being alone in this nightmare, felt the particular isolation that comes from realizing no one is coming to help, that witnesses will watch but not act, that you're on your own against authority that has decided to hurt you. Rebecca was still at her computer, still performing her investigation, and 20 minutes had passed since they'd first approached the gate, and their flight was boarding its final rows, and Amara watched passengers stream past them onto the plane while she and Nia remained detained, remained accused, remained unable to contact their parents or defend themselves or do anything except sit and wait for Rebecca to decide their fate. "Please, ma'am," Amara tried again, her voice hoarse from crying. "Our grandmother is turning 85. This trip is really important to our family. We've been planning it for months. If we miss this flight, we won't make it to her birthday party. Please just verify our tickets so we can board. We're not bad kids. We're not thieves. We just want to see our grandmother." Rebecca looked up from her computer with an expression that showed she'd heard every word and didn't care, with a face that revealed she understood she was hurting them and was enjoying it. And she said, "Your grandmother's birthday is not my concern. What concerns me is potential fraud. And until I'm satisfied that these tickets are legitimate, you're not boarding anything. Now I've told you multiple times to be quiet. If you interrupt me one more time, I'm calling security to have you forcibly removed." And Amara felt something break inside her, felt the last thread of hope that this would resolve peacefully snap under the weight of Rebecca's intractable cruelty. If you're watching this and you've ever stayed silent when children were being abused by someone in authority, subscribe to this channel right now and promise yourself you'll speak up next time, because what happens when this gate agent's cruelty escalates will show you that silence enables the worst outcomes, that watching without acting makes you complicit in trauma that could have been prevented. So hit that subscribe button if you believe protecting vulnerable people matters more than your comfort or your flight schedule, because these girls needed a terminal full of adults to defend them and got mostly cameras and contempt. The final boarding call was made for their flight, the gate agent announcing that the aircraft door would be closing in 2 minutes, and Amara watched the last passengers board while she and Nia remained trapped in Rebecca's investigation that had produced no evidence because there was no evidence, that had found nothing because there was nothing to find except two black children with legitimate tickets who Rebecca had decided didn't belong in first class, and as the gate door closed and their flight pushed back from the terminal without them, Amara realized they'd missed it, had lost their chance to make their grandmother's birthday, and the realization brought fresh tears because all of this suffering, all of this humiliation, all of this trauma had been for nothing, had resulted in exactly what Rebecca had wanted from the beginning, which was preventing them from traveling, from reaching their grandmother, from being treated like the legitimate passengers they were. "We missed our flight," Nia sobbed, looking at the empty jet bridge where their plane had been. "We're not going to make it to Grandma's birthday. This is so unfair. We didn't do anything wrong. Why did this happen to us?" And her voice carried the particular devastation of a child who's learning that fairness is a lie, that doing everything right doesn't protect you, that adults can hurt you and face no consequences. And Amara pulled her sister close and said, "I'm so sorry, baby. I'm so sorry I couldn't fix this. I tried, I really tried," but her apologies felt hollow because sorry didn't get them on that plane, didn't undo the last hour of torture, didn't give them back their phones or their dignity or their faith that the world was just. Rebecca was still at her podium acting like she was working on something important, still pretending that her investigation had merit, still performing diligence that was really just cruelty with bureaucratic cover, and Amara felt rage building inside her, felt fury at this woman who'd stolen their trip and their property and their sense of safety, and she made a decision that she needed their phones back, that she couldn't just sit here powerless anymore, that she had to fight back even if fighting back was dangerous. Amara stood up and walked to Rebecca's podium with more confidence than she felt, with determination born from having nothing left to lose, and she said, "We missed our flight because of you, because you delayed us with a fake investigation. Now give us our phones back so we can call our parents and figure out what to do next. You have no right to keep our property." And Rebecca looked up with surprise that a child she'd successfully intimidated was now challenging her, with annoyance that Amara wasn't accepting defeat quietly, and she said, "I already told you the phones are evidence. You'll get them back when I'm done. Now go sit down before I call security like I've warned you multiple times." But Amara didn't move, didn't back down, and she said, "You're not investigating anything. You're just being racist. You targeted us because we're black. You stole our phones because you could. Now give them back or I'm going to start screaming until someone makes you give them back." The threat seemed to enrage Rebecca beyond reason, seemed to trigger something in her that made her abandon any pretense of professionalism, and she stood up and came around the podium and got in Amara's face and said, "You don't get to threaten me. You don't get to call me racist. I've had enough of your attitude and your disrespect." And she shoved Amara backward with both hands, shoved hard enough that Amara stumbled and nearly fell. And several passengers gasped, but still no one intervened. Still no one stepped between an adult assaulting a child. Amara caught her balance and said with tears streaming down her face, "You just pushed me, you attacked me, everyone saw it, you can't do that, I'm a child." And Rebecca said, "You're a thief who's been lying to me for an hour, now get away from my podium or the next thing that happens will be much worse." Amara backed away from Rebecca but moved toward the pocket of Rebecca's jacket that was hanging on a hook behind the podium, moved toward where she could see the outline of their phones, and she reached for the jacket intending to retrieve what was rightfully theirs, intending to take back the property Rebecca had stolen. But before her hand could reach the pocket, Rebecca saw what she was doing and reacted with violence so sudden and so shocking that everyone watching would remember the moment forever. Rebecca grabbed Nia's wheelchair and with both hands on the handles she kicked the wheelchair forward with brutal force, kicked it so hard that it rolled several feet and then tipped, and Nia, who wasn't braced for the movement, who'd been sitting there crying and traumatized, was thrown from the wheelchair and landed hard on the airport floor, her small body hitting the tile with a sickening sound that made people scream. "Nia!" Amara screamed, running to where her sister lay on the ground crying in pain and terror. "Nia, are you okay? Baby, can you move? Talk to me, please." And she dropped to her knees beside her sister who was sobbing and trying to understand what had just happened, why she was on the floor, why her back hurt, why an adult had just violently attacked her. "I can't get up," Nia cried. "I can't move my legs right. Amara, help me. Why did she do that? Why would she hurt me?" And Amara tried to help her sister while crying so hard she could barely see, tried to be gentle because Nia's spinal injury meant any impact could be serious, tried to assess whether her sister was more hurt than she'd been before this assault. And all around them passengers were finally reacting, were finally speaking up now that the violence had escalated to something they couldn't ignore. "Oh my God, that's a child," a woman said. "She just kicked that child's wheelchair. Someone call security, someone call the police. This is assault." And several people pulled out phones to call for help while others recorded the aftermath. And a man approached Rebecca and said, "What is wrong with you? That's a disabled child. You could have seriously injured her." And Rebecca said with no remorse visible on her face, "She was trying to steal evidence. I was preventing theft. That child and her sister are criminals and they got what criminals deserve." The casual cruelty of the statement, the complete absence of empathy or recognition that she just hurt an 11-year-old, made clear that Rebecca's racism had dehumanized these girls so completely that she felt no guilt about attacking them, felt justified in her violence, felt like the victim rather than the perpetrator. Amara managed to get Nia back into her wheelchair with help from a passenger who'd finally overcome their paralysis enough to assist, and both girls were crying so hard they were hyperventilating, were traumatized beyond what children should have to endure, were learning lessons about racism and violence that would mark them permanently. Nia's back hurt where she'd hit the floor, her dignity was shattered from being thrown from her wheelchair in front of hundreds of strangers, her sense of safety was destroyed by the knowledge that an adult could hurt her and feel proud of it, and she clung to Amara saying, "I want to go home, I don't want to be here anymore, please make her leave us alone, please make this stop." Several passengers who'd been silent before were finally speaking up, were finally finding their voices now that the abuse had reached a level they couldn't rationalize away. And they surrounded Rebecca saying, "You need to give those girls their phones back. You need to let them contact their parents. What you did was assault and you're going to face consequences." But Rebecca just raised her voice and said, "All of you need to back away from my gate area. You're interfering with airline operations. If you don't disperse immediately, I'll have security remove all of you." And her use of authority to silence dissent worked on most of the passengers who didn't want to risk their own travel, who didn't want to become targets themselves, who backed away, leaving Amara and Nia alone again despite their good intentions. Amara held her sister and felt despair so complete it was suffocating, felt powerless in ways she'd never experienced, felt trapped by a system that protected Rebecca's authority while ignoring their humanity, and she didn't know what to do, didn't know how to fix this, didn't know how to protect Nia from more harm when the person causing harm had all the power and they had none. And she looked at her sister's face and saw pain mixed with humiliation, saw tears that wouldn't stop flowing, saw an 11-year-old who'd already endured so much with her spinal injury now having to endure assault from someone who was supposed to ensure passenger safety, and Amara felt rage mixing with grief because this wasn't supposed to happen. Children in wheelchairs weren't supposed to be kicked to the ground by adults. Legitimate travelers weren't supposed to be accused of theft and have their property stolen. Black girls doing everything right weren't supposed to end up traumatized in airport terminals while crowds watched. "Does your back hurt worse than before?" Amara asked, trying to assess through her own tears whether Nia needed medical attention beyond the emotional damage that was obvious, trying to determine if Rebecca's violence had caused new physical injury on top of the spinal issues Nia was already recovering from, and Nia said, "Everything hurts. My whole back hurts from hitting the floor. I'm scared something got worse. I'm scared I broke something. What if I can't do physical therapy anymore? What if this made my injury permanent?" And her words broke Amara's heart because that fear was real, because a child with existing spinal trauma being thrown from a wheelchair onto tile floor could absolutely have suffered damage that would complicate her recovery, could have experienced setbacks that would add months to her rehabilitation, could have been hurt in ways that wouldn't be immediately visible but would affect her for years. "We need to get you checked by a doctor," Amara said. "We need to make sure nothing is seriously wrong, but we can't do that without calling mom and dad, and that woman still has our phones." And the circular impossibility of their situation made Amara want to scream because every solution required resources Rebecca had stolen. Every path forward was blocked by the authority figure who should have been helping them but was instead continuing to hurt them. Several passengers approached cautiously, the same ones who'd spoken up after Nia fell, and a middle-aged white woman knelt beside the wheelchair and said, "I saw everything that happened. I recorded it on my phone. That gate agent assaulted your sister and I'm willing to testify to that. I'm so sorry I didn't intervene sooner. I should have said something when she first started accusing you." And her apology was sincere but insufficient because sorry after trauma didn't prevent trauma, didn't give back what violence had stolen, didn't make Nia less hurt or less scared. A white man in business attire said, "I'm going to find airport police. This has gone too far. That woman needs to be arrested for what she did. You girls shouldn't have to deal with this alone." And he walked away with purpose, but Amara had learned not to trust that adults would actually help, had learned that promises of intervention often evaporated when confrontation became inconvenient, and she watched him go with hope that was fragile and conditional. Rebecca was still at her podium acting like nothing unusual had happened, acting like she hadn't just violently assaulted a disabled child, acting like the crowd gathering around her gate wasn't evidence that she'd crossed lines that couldn't be uncrossed. And when another passenger approached her and said, "You need to give those girls their phones back right now. What you did was criminal," Rebecca said with complete confidence, "I acted within my authority as a gate agent to prevent theft and interference with my investigation. Those girls and anyone defending them need to disperse or I'll have you all removed from the terminal. This is your final warning." The threat worked on most of the people who'd been speaking up, worked on passengers who'd found courage briefly but lost it when their own travel was threatened, worked on people who wanted to help but not enough to risk becoming targets themselves, and they backed away muttering about how terrible this was but not actually doing anything to stop it. And Amara watched them retreat and felt abandoned all over again, felt the particular pain of being defended only until defending became costly, of being supported only until support required sacrifice. The black couple who debated helping earlier finally approached. The woman saying, "We should have spoken up sooner. We were scared and that was cowardly. We're so sorry. Is there anything we can do to help?" And Amara said, "Can you call the police? Can you report what she did to my sister? We don't have our phones and she won't give them back." And the woman nodded and pulled out her phone and dialed 911. And she explained to the dispatcher that there was an assault at gate 22, that a gate agent had attacked a child in a wheelchair, that police presence was urgently needed. But even as help was supposedly coming, even as multiple passengers were calling authorities, the girls remained trapped in limbo with Rebecca still in control of their phones, still unpunished for her violence, still wearing her uniform and her authority like armor that made her untouchable. And Amara realized that waiting for rescue wasn't enough, that passive hoping for adults to fix this had failed repeatedly, that she needed to take action herself, needed to do something that couldn't be ignored or dismissed or swept away by Rebecca's authority. The idea came to her suddenly, born from desperation and fury and the knowledge that silence had enabled Rebecca's abuse, that quiet suffering had gotten them nowhere, that maybe what they needed was the opposite of quiet, was noise so loud that ignoring it became impossible, was a scene so dramatic that intervention became inevitable rather than optional. Amara looked at the terminal around them, at the hundreds of passengers moving through the concourse, at the other gates with their crowds, at the public space where their private suffering had been occurring, and she made a decision that felt both terrifying and necessary, that felt like the only option left when all reasonable options had been exhausted, that felt like taking back power in the only way available to someone with no official authority but with a voice that could still be heard, if she chose to use it loudly enough. She looked at Nia and said, "Baby, I need you to trust me. I'm going to do something that might seem scary, but it's the only way I can think of to make people help us, to make someone stop her, to get our phones back and get us home." "Okay." And Nia nodded through her tears and said, "Okay, sissy, I trust you. Do what you need to do." Amara stood up from where she'd been kneeling beside Nia's wheelchair, stood up and took a deep breath, stood up and felt fear and determination warring inside her. And she looked at Rebecca, who was still at her podium, still acting like she'd done nothing wrong. And Amara thought about her grandmother who'd marched in Selma, who'd faced police dogs and fire hoses, who'd refused to be silent when silence meant accepting injustice, who'd taught her granddaughters that sometimes dignity required making people uncomfortable, required forcing confrontation when politeness had failed, required standing up even when standing up felt impossible. She thought about all the times her parents had told her to be twice as good, to work twice as hard, to never give them a reason to target you, and she realized that being good hadn't protected them, that working hard hadn't mattered, that Rebecca had targeted them anyway because racism didn't require reasons, didn't need justification, just needed opportunity and authority and the confidence that no one would stop it. Amara filled her lungs with air and made her voice as loud as she possibly could, made her voice carry through the terminal like a siren, made her voice impossible to ignore, and she started screaming words that would change everything, words that would freeze the entire airline, words that would finally make people pay attention in ways they couldn't dismiss or walk away from or pretend they hadn't heard. And she shouted, "We are falsely accused. This airline hates black people. We did nothing wrong. Our tickets are legitimate. We didn't steal anything. This is racism. Black Lives Matter." And she repeated it over and over, her voice echoing through the concourse, her words cutting through the normal airport noise of announcements and conversations and rolling luggage, her declaration of injustice so loud and so persistent that people throughout the terminal stopped what they were doing and turned to look. "We are falsely accused," Amara screamed again, pointing at Rebecca. "That gate agent stole our phones. She kicked my sister out of her wheelchair. She assaulted a disabled child. This is racism. Someone help us. Please someone help us. Black Lives Matter." And her voice was raw with emotion, was breaking with tears, but she kept going, kept screaming because silence had gotten them nowhere but noise. Noise was getting attention. Noise was making people stop and stare and pull out their phones to record. Noise was creating witnesses who couldn't claim they didn't know what was happening. Passengers from other gates started walking toward Gate 22 to see what the commotion was about, started gathering in crowds that grew larger with each repetition of Amara's accusations, started forming an audience that Rebecca couldn't dismiss or disperse, started bearing witness in numbers that made ignoring the situation impossible. "This airline hates black people," Amara continued, her voice hoarse but still powerful. "We had legitimate tickets and she accused us of theft. She took our phones so we couldn't call our parents. She kicked my 11-year-old sister out of her wheelchair. This is assault. This is child abuse. This is racism." And Nia was crying in her wheelchair watching her sister fight for both of them. Watching Amara be braver than any 13-year-old should have to be, watching her sister refuse to accept injustice quietly, even though quiet acceptance would have been safer, would have been easier, would have been what every authority figure had tried to force them into. Several security officers were running toward Gate 22 now, drawn by the disturbance, by the shouting that was disrupting terminal operations, by the crowd that was forming and blocking the concourse, and Amara saw them coming and felt fear that they'd silence her, that they'd side with Rebecca, that making noise would result in more punishment, but she kept screaming anyway because stopping felt like surrender. A black man in an expensive suit was walking through the terminal when he heard Amara's voice, heard the words falsely accused and racism and Black Lives Matter, and something in those words, something in the desperation and the courage they carried, made him change direction and walk toward Gate 22, made him push through the crowd that had gathered, made him approach the two black girls at the center of the commotion with professional concern mixing with personal recognition that these children were experiencing something he'd experienced, something he'd spent his career fighting, something he couldn't walk past even though he had a flight to catch in another terminal. The man reached Amara just as security officers arrived, and he held up a hand to the officers and said, "Give me one moment before you intervene. I'm an attorney and I'd like to understand what's happening here," and his voice carried authority that made the security officers pause, that bought Amara precious seconds to explain before being silenced. The man knelt down to Amara's eye level and said, "My name is Marcus Thompson. I'm a civil rights attorney. Tell me what happened. Tell me everything." And Amara looked at his kind face and his expensive suit and his confident demeanor and felt hope surge for the first time in over an hour, felt like maybe finally an adult with power was going to actually help them, and she said through sobs, "That gate agent accused us of stealing our tickets. She took our phones, she kicked my sister out of her wheelchair. My sister has a spinal injury and she just threw her on the floor. We have legitimate tickets. We didn't do anything wrong. She's racist and she's been torturing us for an hour and nobody would help us until I started screaming. Please sir, can you help us? Can you make her give us our phones back? Can you help us call our parents?" Marcus Thompson's face hardened as Amara spoke, his professional experience telling him exactly what he was hearing, his personal history making him understand the particular violation these girls had experienced. And he stood up and looked at Rebecca and said, "I'm attorney Marcus Thompson. I specialize in civil rights cases. I've just heard serious allegations of assault, theft of property, and racial discrimination. I'm formally requesting that airline management be summoned immediately, that these girls' tickets be verified in the system, and that their phones be returned, and I'm documenting everything that happens from this moment forward as potential evidence in federal civil rights litigation. The words federal civil rights litigation seemed to penetrate Rebecca's confidence for the first time, seemed to make her understand that consequences might actually be coming, that this situation had escalated beyond her ability to control through authority and intimidation. Marcus turned to the security officers and said, "These children are alleging assault by that gate agent. I need you to secure the scene and prevent anyone from leaving until airport police arrive. This is a criminal matter now." And the security officers looked uncertain, looked like they weren't sure whether to follow the gate agent's previous instructions to clear the area or to follow this attorney's instructions to secure the scene. And Marcus said, "I'm going to make this very clear. If you allow that gate agent to leave before police arrive, if you allow her to destroy evidence or coordinate stories, you're going to be named as accessories in the civil suit I file on behalf of these minors. Now secure the scene and call your supervisor." Rebecca tried to assert her authority, saying, "I'm a gate agent with Delta Airlines. I was performing my duties. These girls were attempting fraud and I was investigating. This attorney has no authority here." But Marcus said, "Actually, I have every authority that comes from representing victims of assault and discrimination, and you have no authority to assault children, to steal their property, or to racially profile passengers. Now the girls said you took their phones. I'm requesting you return them immediately." And Rebecca said, "Those phones are evidence in my investigation." And Marcus said, "What investigation? Have you contacted airline security? Have you filed a formal incident report? Have you called police? Or did you just unilaterally decide these black children were criminals and take it upon yourself to punish them? Because if it's the latter, then you've committed theft and assault and violated federal civil rights statutes." Marcus pulled out his own phone and said, "I'm calling Delta's corporate legal department right now. I'm calling the airport operations director. I'm calling everyone who needs to know that your airline has an employee assaulting disabled children." And he started making calls while Amara and Nia watched with amazement, with relief, with the first sense of safety they'd felt since this nightmare began, because finally someone with knowledge and authority and determination was fighting for them, was using his power to protect rather than harm them, was intervening in ways that couldn't be dismissed or ignored or deflected by Rebecca's claims of following procedure. Within 5 minutes of Marcus making his calls, a woman in a Delta Airlines supervisor uniform arrived at the gate, practically running, her face showing she understood this was a crisis that required immediate attention, and she looked at the crowd, at the girls, at Rebecca, at Marcus, and said, "Someone tell me what happened here right now." And Marcus said, "I'm attorney Marcus Thompson. I represent these 2 minor passengers who are alleging they were assaulted by your gate agent after being racially profiled and falsely accused of fraud. Their tickets need to be verified immediately." And the supervisor, whose name tag read Jennifer Williams, looked at Rebecca and said, "Is this true? Did you assault these children?" And Rebecca started to answer, but Marcus cut her off, saying, "Before your employee provides her version, I need you to know that multiple passengers recorded the assault on video, that I have witness statements from at least a dozen people, and that these girls' phones, which contain evidence of their legitimate ticket purchase, are currently in that gate agent's possession after she confiscated them without legal authority." Jennifer turned to Rebecca and said with barely controlled fury, "Give me those phones right now." And Rebecca hesitated, clearly understanding that returning the phones would eliminate her claim that they were evidence, would prove she'd been lying about conducting a legitimate investigation. But Jennifer said, "I'm not asking. I'm ordering you as your supervisor to return property you took from minor passengers. Hand them over immediately or you're suspended on the spot." Rebecca slowly reached into her jacket pocket and pulled out both phones, handed them to Jennifer, who immediately gave them to Amara, saying, "I'm so sorry this happened to you. These should never have been taken." And Amara grabbed her phone with shaking hands and immediately called her father. And David Johnson answered on the first ring, saying, "Amara, baby, where are you? We've been trying to reach you for an hour. Your flight tracker says you missed your flight. What's going on?" And Amara said, through fresh tears, "Dad, something really bad happened. A gate agent attacked us. She kicked Nia out of her wheelchair. She took our phones. We need you." And David's voice, when he responded, carried the particular terror of a parent learning their children had been hurt while he was too far away to protect them. "I'm getting the next flight to Chicago right now," David said. "I'm coming to get you. Are you safe? Is Nia okay? Has she been checked by a doctor?" And Amara said we don't know if she's okay, her back hurts from hitting the floor, we need to get her checked but we didn't have phones to call you. Dad, I was so scared, I didn't know what to do. And David said you did everything right, baby, you survived, you protected your sister. I'm so proud of you. Now put me on speaker so I can talk to whoever's in charge there. Amara put the phone on speaker and Marcus introduced himself saying, Mr. Johnson, I'm attorney Marcus Thompson. I happen to witness part of what your daughters experienced and I've intervened on their behalf. I'm going to make sure they're protected and that everyone responsible faces consequences. And David said, thank you for helping my girls. I need to speak with whoever supervises that gate agent. Jennifer took the phone and identified herself and said, Mr. Johnson, I'm the duty manager for this terminal. I'm conducting an immediate investigation into what happened. I need you to know that based on preliminary information, the gate agent involved is being removed from duty effective immediately. We take allegations of assault and discrimination with the utmost seriousness. And David said you better take them seriously because my daughters are traumatized. My 11-year-old who's recovering from a spinal injury was thrown from her wheelchair onto the floor. If she's been injured further, you're going to face litigation that will cost your airline millions. Now I need you to get my daughter's medical attention immediately. I need Nia evaluated by a doctor to make sure that assault didn't cause new damage. And I need both my daughters treated with the care and respect they should have received from the beginning. Jennifer said, I'm arranging for medical personnel right now. I'm also arranging for your daughters to be booked on the next available flight to Atlanta with an airline escort to ensure they have support, and all costs will be covered by Delta. We're going to do everything we can to make this right. And David said making it right means firing that gate agent, means pressing criminal charges, means implementing changes so this never happens to another family. My daughters had legitimate tickets. They had all their documentation, they followed every rule, and they were still targeted and assaulted because they're black. That's not an operational failure, that's a civil rights violation, and I'm going to make sure everyone understands that. Airport police arrived while this conversation was happening. 3 officers whom Marcus immediately approached saying, I'm representing the victims of an assault that occurred at this gate. That gate agent in the Delta uniform kicked an 11-year-old child out of her wheelchair. I have multiple witnesses and video evidence. I need you to take statements and file charges. And the officers looked at Rebecca and then at Nia in her wheelchair with visible bruising on her arm from where she'd hit the floor, and the lead officers said we're going to need everyone involved to provide statements, starting with the children if they're comfortable speaking with us. Amara recounted the entire ordeal for the police, from the initial accusation of theft through the confiscation of phones through the assault on Nia, and with each detail Rebecca's face grew paler as she seemed to finally understand that her actions were going to have consequences she couldn't avoid, that her authority as a gate agent wasn't protecting her anymore. That witnesses and video evidence and a civil rights attorney meant she couldn't spin this as justified enforcement of airline policy. Medical personnel arrived and examined Nia, checking her range of motion and asking about pain levels. And they said she needed to go to the hospital for x-rays to rule out new spinal injury, that the impact from falling could have caused damage that wouldn't be immediately apparent, and Amara felt her heart sink because this was exactly what they'd feared, that Rebecca's violence might have undone months of Nia's recovery, might have caused permanent harm beyond the psychological trauma. An ambulance was called and Amara insisted on going with her sister, and Marcus said, I'll accompany them to the hospital. I'll make sure they're not alone. Mr. Johnson, I'm giving you my cell number. Call me and I'll keep you updated on everything. And David said, thank you for being there when I couldn't be. Please take care of my girls. Rebecca was told by police that she was being detained for questioning, that charges of assault on a minor were being filed, that she needed to come to the station to provide a formal statement, and as officers escorted her away from the gate, she was no longer wearing her authority like armor, was no longer confident and contemptuous, was instead frightened and diminished, was facing consequences that her years of getting away with mistreatment hadn't prepared her for. Jennifer, the supervisor, approached Amara before the ambulance transport and said, I want you to know that gate agent is terminated effective immediately. She will never work for Delta Airlines again. We're conducting a full investigation into how she was hired and whether there were previous complaints we failed to address, and we're implementing immediate training and oversight changes. But I know that doesn't undo what you experienced, doesn't give you back what was taken, and I'm truly sorry. The ambulance took Nia and Amara to Northwestern Memorial Hospital where x-rays revealed no new spinal damage. where doctors said Nia had been incredibly lucky that the fall hadn't caused serious injury, where both girls were treated for shock and trauma and released after several hours with instructions to follow up with Nia's regular doctors. And throughout the medical examination, Amara held her sister's hand and thought about how close they'd come to much worse outcomes, how Rebecca's violence could have paralyzed Nia permanently, how their grandmother's birthday celebration had been stolen by racism that decided black children were threats, and when their parents arrived at the hospital having caught the first available flight back to Chicago, David and Michelle Johnson held their daughters and cried with relief that they were physically okay mixed with fury that this had happened at all. That sending their children on what should have been a routine trip had resulted in assault and trauma that would mark them forever. The investigation that followed moved with unusual speed given the video evidence and witness statements that made Rebecca Morrison's guilt undeniable, made her actions impossible to defend or minimize, and within 48 hours Delta Airlines issued a formal statement announcing that Rebecca had been terminated for gross misconduct including assault on minor passengers, theft of passenger property, racial discrimination, and violation of every passenger service protocol the airline had, and the statement included an apology to the Johnson family and a commitment to comprehensive review of hiring and training practices that had allowed someone with Rebecca's prejudices to remain employed for 20 years. But the corporate apology felt hollow to Amara and Nia, who were dealing with nightmares and anxiety and the particular trauma that comes from being attacked by someone whose job was protecting you, who were learning that apologies after harm don't undo harm, don't give back the sense of safety that violence stole, don't make airports feel like neutral spaces rather than places where they might be targeted again. Marcus Thompson filed a federal civil rights lawsuit on behalf of the Johnson family within a week of the incident, seeking damages not just for the assault but for the emotional distress, the violation of civil rights, the discrimination that had motivated every aspect of Rebecca's treatment of the girls. And the lawsuit named both Rebecca personally and Delta Airlines for creating and maintaining an environment where racial profiling could occur without adequate oversight or consequences. Until someone with resources and connections forced accountability. The lawsuit detailed every moment of the girls' ordeal, every accusation and threat and act of cruelty, every instance where Rebecca's racism had overridden procedure and humanity, and reading it made the Johnson family relive trauma they were trying to process, made them confront in legal language the violation their daughters had experienced, made abstract concepts like discrimination and assault concrete through specific descriptions of what Rebecca had done and said. Delta settled the lawsuit 6 months later for an amount that was never publicly disclosed but that sources suggested was in the 7-figure range, money that went into trust funds for Amara's and Nia's education and future, money that represented acknowledgement that harm had occurred and deserved compensation even though no amount of money could actually compensate for stolen innocence, for learned fear, for the knowledge that excellent behavior provides no protection against hatred that decides you're guilty based on your appearance. The settlement included provisions requiring Delta to implement comprehensive anti-discrimination training, to create independent oversight for passenger complaints involving potential racial bias, to establish rapid response protocols for incidents involving unaccompanied minors, changes that might protect future families but that came too late for the Johnsons, that represented progress built on their daughter's suffering. The criminal case against Rebecca Morrison proceeded separately from the civil lawsuit, prosecutors charging her with assault and battery on a minor, theft, and civil rights violations with hate crime enhancements, charges that collectively carried potential prison time that Rebecca's attorney tried to argue was excessive for what he characterized as a momentary lapse in judgment by someone with an otherwise clean record. But the video evidence and witness testimony made clear this wasn't momentary lapse but sustained cruelty, wasn't poor judgment but deliberate racism, wasn't an accident but intentional assault on a disabled child, and the jury deliberated less than 3 hours before convicting Rebecca on all counts. And the judge in sentencing said that people in positions of authority who abuse that authority to harm vulnerable people deserve consequences severe enough to deter others from similar conduct. And he sentenced Rebecca to 5 years in prison, denied bail pending appeal, sent her immediately to begin serving a sentence that would cost her everything she'd built over 20 years of employment. Rebecca Morrison's life collapsed with a completeness that might have generated sympathy if her victim had been anyone other than an 11-year-old in a wheelchair, if her crime had been anything other than racist violence against children, and she served her 5 years in federal prison while her family distanced themselves, while her friends stopped visiting. While she became known not as Rebecca the longtime gate agent but as Rebecca the woman who kicked a disabled black child, her identity permanently defined by her worst actions in ways that would follow her even after release. She was released after serving her full sentence with no early parole, emerged from prison at 54 years old with no career prospects, with a criminal record that made employment nearly impossible, with a name that Google searches immediately connected to viral videos of her assault, with a life that had been destroyed by choices she'd made when she thought her racism would face no consequences. Meanwhile, the Johnson family tried to move forward even though moving forward didn't mean moving past, didn't mean forgetting or healing completely, didn't mean their daughters weren't changed by what they'd experienced. Amara and Nia missed their grandmother's 85th birthday party that they'd been so excited about, missed the celebration they'd prepared for, missed the chance to present gifts they'd carefully chosen, and even though their grandmother understood and said the important thing was that they were safe, the girls felt the loss of that milestone, felt robbed of joy they'd been anticipating, felt like Rebecca had stolen not just hours at an airport but memories they'd never get to make. Their parents rescheduled the trip for 2 months later, arranged to fly as a family rather than sending the girls alone, and this time they made it to Atlanta without incident, made it to their grandmother's house where Gloria held her granddaughters and cried about what they'd endured, and the family celebrated belatedly with love that was tinged with sorrow, with joy that was complicated by trauma, with gratitude that was mixed with grief for innocence that couldn't be restored. The birthday party became a space where the girl's story was told and retold, where relatives who'd heard about the incident through phone calls now heard first-hand accounts, where Amara's courage in refusing to stay silent was praised by aunts and uncles and cousins who recognized that her boldness in making a scene had been the turning point, that her willingness to scream accusations of racism in a crowded terminal had been what finally forced intervention, what had attracted Marcus Thompson's attention, what had made ignoring their suffering impossible for the hundreds of witnesses who might otherwise have walked past 2 more black children being mistreated by authority. Grandmother Gloria, 85 years old and carrying memories of segregation and civil rights marches and decades of fighting racism in its evolving forms, held Amara's face in her weathered hands and said, "Baby girl, you did what I taught your father to do, what I learned in Selma, which is that silence protects oppressors, that making people uncomfortable is sometimes the only way to make them act, that your voice raised in righteous anger is more powerful than any weapon they can use against you, and I'm so proud of you even though I hate that you had to learn these lessons so young, hate that my grandbabies had to experience what I'd hoped your generation would be spared." The praise felt complicated to Amara, who appreciated being told she'd been brave but who didn't feel brave, who felt like she'd just been desperate, who'd screamed because screaming was the only option left when everything else had failed, who'd caused a scene not because she was courageous but because she was terrified and powerless and didn't know what else to do. "I was so scared, Grandma," Amara said through tears. "I thought we were going to be arrested. I thought they were going to take Nia away from me. I thought we'd never see Mom and Dad again. I wasn't brave, I was just trying not to lose my sister." And Gloria said that's what bravery is, baby. It's being scared and acting anyway. It's protecting the people you love even when protection feels impossible. It's refusing to accept injustice even when accepting it would be easier. You were brave whether you felt brave or not. But the reality was that legal victory and family praise couldn't undo what had been done, couldn't give the girls back the parts of themselves that had been damaged by Rebecca's assault and by the system that had enabled it, couldn't restore the innocence that came from believing that following rules would protect you, that being excellent would shield you from racism, that adults in authority would help rather than harm. Nia developed severe anxiety around airports that persisted long after the physical bruises from her fall had healed, would have panic attacks when they needed to fly anywhere, would cry and beg to drive instead even when driving meant adding days to travel time, would relive the moment of being kicked from her wheelchair in nightmares that woke her screaming several times a week for months after the incident. Her physical therapy progress, which had been so promising before the assault, stalled as her anxiety made it difficult to focus, made her body tense in ways that interfered with the exercises designed to restore her mobility, made her recovery more complicated than it should have been because trauma was affecting her physically in ways that doctors couldn't easily treat. Amara carried guilt that therapy couldn't fully address, guilt that she hadn't protected Nia better, that she'd pulled out her phone which had triggered Rebecca's violence, that she'd made decisions that had resulted in her sister being hurt even though rationally she knew none of it was her fault. Knew Rebecca alone was responsible for Rebecca's actions, knew she'd done everything she could have done. The guilt manifested in hypervigilance around Nia, in Amara constantly checking that her sister was okay, in refusing to let Nia out of her sight, in taking responsibility for her sister's well-being in ways that went beyond normal sibling care and became burden that a 13-year-old shouldn't carry. Their parents got them both into therapy specializing in racial trauma, into support groups for children who'd experienced discrimination, into spaces where they could process what had happened with people who understood that this wasn't just about one bad interaction but about systemic racism that had marked them in ways that would influence how they moved through the world forever. The girls returned to school as minor celebrities, their story having been covered by local and then national news, their classmates and teachers treating them with a mixture of sympathy and curiosity that felt uncomfortable, that made them feel exposed, that made normal middle school social dynamics more complicated because everyone knew what had happened to them, everyone had opinions about it, everyone wanted to discuss it when sometimes Amara and Nia just wanted to be regular kids who weren't defined by their trauma. Some classmates were supportive, created a kindness campaign at school to raise awareness about discrimination, organized assemblies where the girls could share their story if they wanted though they usually didn't, tried to turn something terrible into something educational. Other classmates were cruel in the way middle schoolers can be cruel, making jokes about wheelchairs, making comments about playing the race card, parroting their parents' opinions that the girls had been too sensitive, that Rebecca had just been doing her job, that everything would have been fine if they just complied quietly. If this story broke your heart, if it made you realize that standing up against injustice requires courage you hope you'd have if tested, then subscribe to this channel and commit to being the person who intervenes when children are being targeted, who speaks up when authority is being abused, who refuses to let racism operate unchallenged in your presence. Because Amara and Nia needed a terminal full of adults to protect them and got mostly silence until one girl decided screaming was better than suffering quietly. So hit that subscribe button if you believe protecting vulnerable people matters more than your comfort, because next time you witness injustice, your voice could be what makes the difference between trauma and safety. 3 years after the incident, Amara was 16 and Nia was 14, both of them carrying forward into their teenage years the knowledge that racism could strike anywhere, that authority figures couldn't always be trusted, that being black meant constant vigilance against people who decided your skin color made you suspicious, but they'd also learned that their voices mattered, that refusing silence had power, that making noise had saved them when quiet suffering had gotten them nowhere. Nia had eventually regained full mobility, her spinal injury fully healed despite the setback from Rebecca's assault, and she walked without assistance though she carried emotional scars that would never fully heal, carried memories of lying on an airport floor wondering why an adult had hurt her, carried knowledge that had aged her beyond her years. Amara became an activist, speaking at conferences about racial profiling, testifying before transportation committees about needed reforms, using their story to educate and advocate even though every telling was painful, even though reliving it for audiences meant keeping trauma fresh rather than letting it fade. She'd turned Rebecca's cruelty into purpose, had transformed victimization into advocacy, had refused to let racism have the final word even though it had marked her permanently, and she spoke with authority that came from experience, with passion that came from remembering her sister's tears, with determination that came from wanting to prevent other families from experiencing what hers had endured. Rebecca Morrison was released from prison after serving her full 5-year sentence, emerged at 54 with no career prospects and a permanently damaged reputation, lived the rest of her life defined by the worst thing she'd ever done, by the video that would never disappear from the internet, by the name that would always be associated with kicking a disabled black child. Her racism having destroyed not just the lives she targeted but her own life as well. She died at 68, largely alone, her obituary mentioning her crime more prominently than her decades of employment, her legacy reduced to a cautionary tale about how hatred hurts everyone it touches. The Johnson family moved forward carrying both victory and scars, Carrying justice that felt incomplete because justice after trauma never fully heals. Carrying changes they'd forced in airline policy that would protect others but couldn't protect them retroactively. Carrying a story that was both inspiring in its demonstration of courage and heartbreaking in its demonstration of necessity. Because children shouldn't have to be that brave, shouldn't have to scream for help in terminals. Shouldn't have to learn at 11 and 13 that excellence provides no protection against racism that decides you're guilty. But they did, and they survived, and they transformed survival into testimony, into warning, into hope that maybe, eventually, their courage would contribute to a world where Black children could travel without fear, where disabled passengers could board without being targeted, where making a scene wouldn't be necessary because justice would be automatic rather than something you had to fight for.